Welcome to this compilation of 4 sci-fi short stories about love and relationships in the future. I'll be narrating The Last Letter by Fritz Leiber, A Fall of Glass by Stanley R. Lee, Easy Does It by G. von Wald, and Manners of the Age by H. B. Fyfe. If you find yourself enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel. And for more of my narrations, consider signing up to my Patreon. There you'll get exclusive monthly novelettes, early access to full novels, and ad-free audio and video versions of all stories. And your contributions will keep this channel thriving. Head to patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF to find out more. But for now, let's get on with the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Last Letter by Fritz Leiber. Narrated by William Skye. Who or what was the scoundrel that kept these couriers from the swift completion of their handsomely appointed rondos? On 10th the 1st, 2457 AD, at exactly 9 AM Planetary Federation time, but with a permissible error of a millionth of a second either way, in the 5th sublevel of New York, Robot Postal Station 68, Black Sorter gulped down 10,000 pieces of first-class mail. This breakfast tidbit did not agree with the mail sorting machine. It was as if a robust dog had been fed a large chunk of good red meat with a strychnine pill in it. Black Sorter's innards went whir, clunk. A blue electric glow enveloped him, and he began to shake as if he might break loose from the concrete. He desperately spat back over his shoulder a single envelope, gave a great huff, and blew out toward the sorting tubes a medium-sized snowstorm consisting of the other 9,999 pieces of first-class mail chewed to confetti. Then, still convulsed, he snatched up a fresh 10,000 and proceeded to chomp and grind on them. Black Sorter was rugged. The rejected envelope was tongued up by Red Subsorter, who growled deep in his throat, said a very bad word, and passed it to Yellow Rerouter, who passed it to Green Rerouter, who passed it to Brown Study, who passed it to Pink Wastebasket. Unlike Black Sorter, Pink Wastebasket was very delicate, though highly intuitive, the machine equivalent of a white Russian countess. She was designed to scan in 3,137 codes, route special delivery space mail to interplanetary liners by messenger rocket, and distinguish 9s from upside-down 6s. Pink Wastebasket haughtily inhaled the offending envelope and almost instantly turned a bright crimson and began to tremble. After a few minutes, small atomic flames started to flicker from her midsection. White Nursemaid 7 and Greasy Joe both received Pink Wastebasket's distress signal and got there as fast as their wheels would roll them, but the high-born machine's malady was beyond their simple skills of oil can and electroshock. They summoned other machine-tending and repairing machines, ones far more expert than themselves, but all were baffled. It was clear that Pink Wastebasket, who continued to tremble and flicker uncontrollably, was suffering from the equivalent of a major psychosis with severe psychosomatic symptoms. She spat a stream of filthy ions at Grey Psychiatrist, not recognizing her old friend. Meanwhile, the paper blizzard from Black Sorter was piling up in great drifts between the dark pillars of the sublevel, and flurries had reached Pink Wastebasket's aristocratic area. An expedition of sturdy machines, headed by 2 hastily summoned snowplows, was dispatched to immobilize Black Sorter at all costs. Pink Wastebasket, quivering like a demented hula dancer, was clearly approaching a crisis. Finally, Grey Psychiatrist, after consulting with Green Surgeon, and even then with an irritated reluctance, as if he were calling in a witch doctor, summoned a human being. The human being walked respectfully around Pink Wastebasket several times, and then gave her a nervous little poke with a rubber-handled probe. Pink Wastebasket gently regurgitated her last snack, turned dead white, gave a last flicker and shake, and expired. Black coroner recorded the immediate cause of death as tinkering by a human being. The human being, a bald and scrawny one named Potshelter, picked up the envelope responsible for all the trouble, stared at it incredulously, opened it with trembling fingers, scanned the contents briefly, gave a great shriek, and ran off at top speed, forgetting to hop on his perambulator, which followed him, making anxious clucking noises. The nearest human representative of the Solar Bureau of Investigation, a rather wooden-looking man named Crumbine, also bald, recognized Potshelter as soon as the latter burst gasping into his office, squeezing through the door while it was still dilating. The human beings whose work took them among the top brass, as the upper echelon machines were sometimes referred to, formed a kind of human elite, just one big, nervous family. "Sit down, Potshelter," the SBI man said. "Hold still a second so the chair can grab you. Hitch onto the hooker and choose a tranquilizer from the tray at your elbow. Whatever deviation you've uncovered can't be that much of a danger to the planets. I imagine that when you leave this office, the solar battle fleet will still be orbiting peacefully around Luna." "I seriously doubt that." Potshelter gulped a large lavender pill and took a deep breath. "Crumbine, a letter turned up in the first-class mail this morning." "Great Scott!" "It is a letter from one person to another person." "Good Lord!" "The flow of advertising has been seriously interfered with. At a modest estimate, 300 million pieces of expensive first-class advertising have already been chewed to rags, and I'm not sure the steel helms, God bless them, have the trouble in hand yet." "Judas Priest!" "Naturally, the poor machines weren't able to cope with the letter. It was utterly outside their experience, beyond the furthest reach of their programming. It threw them into a terrible spasm. Pink Wastebasket is dead, and at this very instant, if we're lucky, 3 police machines of the toughest blued steel are holding down Black Sorter and putting a muzzle on him." "Great Scott! It's incredible, Potshelter! And Pink Wastebasket dead? Take another tranquilizer, Potshelter, and hand over the tray." Crumbine received it with trembling fingers, started to pick up a big pink pill, but drew back his hand from it in sudden revulsion at its colour, and swallowed 2 blue oval ones instead. The man was obviously fighting to control himself. He said unsteadily, "I almost never take doubles, but this news you bring, good Lord. I seem to recall a case where someone tried to send a sound tape through the mails, but that was before my time. Incidentally, is there any possibility that this is a letter sent by one group of persons to another group? A hive or a therapy group or a social club? That would be bad enough, of course, but—" "No, just one single person sending to another." Potshelter's expression set in grimly solicitous lines. "I can see you don't quite understand, Crumbine. This is not a sound tape, but a letter written in letters. You know, letters, characters, like books." "Don't mention books in this office!" Crumbine drew himself up angrily and then slumped back. "Excuse me, Potshelter, but I find this very difficult to face squarely. Do I understand you to say that one person has tried to use the mails to send a printed sheet of some sort to another?" "Worse than that. A written letter." "Written? I don't recognize the word." "It's a way of making characters, of forming visual equivalents of sound without using electricity. The writer, as he's called, employs a black liquid and a pointed stick called a pen. I know about this because one hobby of mine is ancient means of communication." Crumbine frowned and shook his head. "Communication is a dangerous business, Potshelter, especially at the personal level. With you and me it's all right, because we know what we're doing." He picked up a 3rd blue tranquilizer. "But with most of the hive folk, person-to-person communication is only a morbid form of advertising, a dangerous travesty of normal newscasting, catharsis without the analyst, recitation without the teacher, a perversion of promotion employed in betraying and subverting." The frown deepened as he put the blue pill in his mouth and chewed it. But about this pen, do you mean the fellow glues the pointed stick to his tongue and then speaks, and the black liquid traces the vibrations on the paper? A primitive non-electrical oscilloscope? Sloppy but conceivable, and producing a record of sorts of the spoken word. No, Crumbine. Potshelter nervously popped a square orange tablet into his mouth. It's a handwritten letter. Crumbine watched him. I never mix tranquilizers, he boasted absently. Handwritten, eh? You mean that the message was imprinted on a hand? And the skin or the entire hand afterward detached and sent through the mails in the fashion of a Martian reproach? A grisly find indeed, Potshelter. You still don't quite grasp it, Crumbine. The fingers of the hand move the stick that applies the ink, producing a crude imitation of the printed word. Diabolical! Crumbine smashed his fist down on the desk so that the 4 phones and 2 score microphones rattled. I tell you, Potshelter, the SBI is ready to cope with the subtlest modern deceptions, but when fiends search out and revive tricks from the pre-atomic cave era, it's almost too much. But great Scott, I dally while the planets are in danger. What's the sender's code on this hellish letter? No code, Potshelter said darkly, proffering the envelope. The return address is handwritten. Crumbine blanched as his eyes slowly traced the uneven lines in the upper left-hand corner. From Richard Rowe, 215 West 10th Street, horizontal, 2837 Rocket Court, vertical, Hive 37, New York 319, NY, Columbia, Terra. Ugh, Crumbine said, shivering. Those crawling characters, those letters as you call them, those things, barely enough like print to be readable, they seem to be on the verge of awakening all sorts of horrid racial memories. I find myself thinking of fur-clad witch doctors dipping long pointed sticks in bubbling black cauldrons. No wonder Pink Wastebasket couldn't take it, brave girl. Firming himself behind his desk, he pushed a number of buttons and spoke long numbers and meaningful alphabetical syllables into several microphones. Banks of coloured lights around the desk began to blink like a theatre marquee sending Morse code, while phosphorescent arrows crawled purposefully across maps and space charts and through 3-dimensional street diagrams. There, he said at last. The sender of the letter is being apprehended and will be brought directly here. We'll see what sort of man this Richard Rowe is, if we can assume he's human. 7 precautionary cordons are being drawn around his population station, 3 composed of machines, 2 of SBI agents, and 2 consisting of human and mechanical medical combat teams. Same goes for the intended recipient of the letter. Meanwhile, a destroyer squadron of the Solar Fleet has been detached to orbit over New York. In case it becomes necessary to Z-bomb? Potshelter asked grimly. Crumbine nodded. With all those villains lurking just outside the solar system in their invisible black ships, with planeticide in their hearts, we can't be too careful. One word transmitted from one spy to another, and anything may happen. And we must bomb before they do, so as to contain our losses. Better one city destroyed than a traitor on the loose who may destroy many cities. 100 years ago, 3 person-to-person postcards went through the mails, just 3 postcards, Potshelter, and poofed went Schenectady, Hoboken, Cicero, and Walla Walla. Here, as long as you're mixing them, try one of these oval blues. I find them best for steady swallowing. Bells jangled. Crumbine grabbed up 2 phones, holding one to each ear. Potshelter automatically picked up a third. The ringing continued. Crumbine started to wedge one of his phones under his chin, nodded sharply at Potshelter and then toward a cluster of microphones at the end of the table. Potshelter picked up a 4th phone from behind them. The ringing stopped. The 2 men listened, looking doped, Crumbine with an eye fixed on the sweep second hand of the large wall clock. When it had made one revolution, he cradled his phones. Potshelter followed suit. I do like the simplicity of the new on-the-hour Puffy Loaf phono commercial, the latter remarked thoughtfully. The bread that's lighter than air. Nice. Crumbine nodded. I hear they've had to add mass to the lead foil wrapping to keep the loaves from floating off the shelves. Fact. He cleared his throat. Too bad we can't listen to more phono commercials, but even when there isn't a crisis on the agenda, I find I have to budget my listening time. 1 minute per hour strikes a reasonable balance between duty and self-indulgence. The nearest wall began to sing. Mr. J. Augustus Crumbine, we all think you're fine, 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 fine. Now out of the sky I blew, come some telegrams for you. The wall opened to a small heart shape toward the centre, and a sheaf of pale yellow envelopes arced out and plopped on the middle of the desk. Crumbine started to leaf through them, scanning the little transparent windows. Electronic soap, better homes and landing platforms, psycho blinkers, your girl next door, poppy woppies, poopsie whoopsies. He started to open an envelope, then, after a quick look around and an apologetic smile at Potshelter, dumped them all on the disposal hopper, which gargled briefly. After all, there is a crisis this morning, he said in a defensive voice. Potshelter nodded absently. I can remember back before personalised delivery and rhyming robots, he observed. But how I'd miss them now, so much more distingué than the hives with their non-personalised radio, TV and stereo advertising. For that matter, I believe there are some backward areas on Terra where the great advertising potential of telephones and telegrams hasn't been fully realised, and they are still used in part for personal communication. Now me, I've never in my life sent or received a message except on my walkie-talkie. He patted his breast pocket. Crumbine nodded, but he was a trifle shocked and inclined to revise his estimate of Potshelter's social status. Crumbine conducted his own social correspondence solely by telepathy. He shared with 3 other SBI officials a private telepath, a charming albino girl named Agnes. Yes, and it's a very handsome walkie-talkie, he assured Potshelter a little falsely. Suits you. I like the upswept antenna. He drummed on the desk and swallowed another blue tranquilizer. Damn it, what's happened to those machines? They ought to have the 2 spies here by now. Did you notice that the second, the intended recipient of the letter I mean, seems to be female? Another good Terran name too, Jane Doe. Hive in Upper Manhattan. He began to tap the envelope sharply against the desk. Damn it, where are they? Excuse me, Potshelter said hesitantly, but I'm wondering why you haven't read the message inside the envelope. Crumbine looked at him blankly. Great Scott! I assumed that at least it was in some sort of secret code, of course. Normally I'd have asked you to have Pink Wastebasket try her skill on it, but... His eyes widened and his voice sank. You don't mean to tell me that it's... Potshelter nodded grimly. Handwritten too, yes. Crumbine winced. I keep trying to forget that aspect of the case. He dug out the message with shaking fingers, fumbled it open, and read. Dear Jane, it must surprise you that I know your name, for our hives are widely separated. Do you recall day before yesterday when your guided tour of Grand Central Spaceport got stalled because the guide blew a fuse? I was the young man with hair in the tour behind yours. You were a little frightened and a group mistress was reassuring you. The machine spoke your name. Since then, I have been unable to forget you. When I go to sleep, I dream of your face looking up sadly at the mistress's kindly photocells. I don't know how to get in touch with you, but my grandfather has told me stories his grandfather told him that his grandfather told him about young men writing what he calls love letters to young ladies. So I am writing you a love letter. I work in a first-class advertising house, and I will slip this love letter into an outgoing 10,000 pack and hope. Do not be frightened of me, Jane. I am no caveman except for my hair. I am not insane. I am emotionally disturbed, but in a way that no machine has ever described to me. I want only your happiness. Sincerely, Richard Roe. Crumbine slumped back in his chair, which braced itself manfully against him, and looked long and thoughtfully at Potshelter. Well, if that's a code, it's certainly a fiendishly subtle one. You'd think he was talking to his girl next door. Potshelter nodded wonderingly. I only read as far as where they were planning to blow up Grand Central Spaceport and all the guides in it. Judas Priest, I think I have it! Crumbine shot up. It's a pilot advertisement, boy next door, or that kind of thing, printed to look like handwrittening, which would make all the difference. And the pilot copy got mailed by accident, which would mean there is no real Richard Roe. At that instant, the door dilated, and 2 blue detective engines hustled a struggling young man into the office. He was slim, rather handsome, had a bushy head of hair that had somehow survived evolution and radioactive fallout, and across the chest and back of his paper singlet was neatly stamped, Richard Roe. When he saw the 2 men, he stopped struggling and straightened up. Excuse me, gentlemen, he said, but these police machines must have made a mistake. I've committed no crime. Then his gaze fell on the hand-addressed envelope on Crumbine's desk, and he turned pale. Crumbine laughed harshly. No crime? No, not at all. Merely using the mails to communicate. Ha! The young man shrank back. I'm sorry, sir. Sorry, he says. Do you realize that your insane prank has resulted in the destruction of perhaps 500 million pieces of first-class advertising, in the strangulation of a postal station and the paralysis of Lower Manhattan, in the mobilization of SBI reserves, the de-mothballing of 2 divisions of GI machines, and the redeployment of the solar battle fleet? Good Lord, boy, why did you do it? Richard Roe continued to shrink, but he squared his shoulders. I'm sorry, sir, but I just had to. I just had to get in touch with Jane Doe. A girl from another hive? A girl you'd merely gazed at because a guide happened to blow a fuse? Crumbine stood up, shaking an angry finger. Great Scott, boy, where was your girl next door? Richard Roe stared bravely at the finger, which made him look a trifle cross-eyed. She died, sir. Both of them. But there should be at least 6. I know, sir, but of the other 4, 2 have been shipped to the Adirondacks on vacation, and 2 recently got married and haven't been replaced. Potshelter, a faraway look in his eyes, said softly, I think I'm beginning to understand. But Crumbine thundered on at Richard Roe with, Good Lord, I can see you've had your troubles, boy. It isn't often we have these shortages of girls next door, so that temporarily a boy can't marry the girl next door, as he always should. But Judas Priest, why didn't you take your troubles to your psychiatrist, your group master, your socializer, your queen mother? My psychiatrist is being overhauled, sir, and his replacement short-circuits every time he hears the word trouble. My group master and socializer are on vacation duty in the Adirondacks. My queen mother is busy replacing girls next door. Yes, it all fits, Potshelter proclaimed excitedly. Don't you see, Crumbine? Except for a set of mischances that would only occur once in a billion times, the letter would never have been conceived or sent. You may have something there, Crumbine concurred. But in any case, boy, why did you, written this letter to this particular girl? What is there about Jane Doe that made you do it? Well, you see, sir, she's... Just then, the door redilated and a blue matron machine conducted a young woman into the office. She was slim, and she had a head of hair that would have graced a museum beauty, while across the back and, well, chest is an inadequate word, of her paper chemise, Jane Doe was silk-screened in the palest pink. Crumbine did not repeat his last question. He had to admit to himself that it had been answered fully. Potshelter whistled respectfully. The blue detective engines gave hard-boiled grunts. Even the blue matron machine seemed awed by the girl's beauty. But she had eyes only for Richard Rowe. "My Grand Central man," she breathed in amazement. "The man I've dreamed of ever since. My man with hair." She noticed the way he was looking at her, and she breathed harder. "Oh, darling, what have you done?" "I tried to send you a letter." "A letter? For me? Oh, darling." Crumbine cleared his throat. "Potshelter, I'm going to wind this up fast. Miss Doe, could you transfer to this young man's hive?" "Oh, yes, sir. Mine has an overplus of girls next door." "Good. Mr. Rowe, there's a sky pilot 2 levels up. Look for the usual white collar just below the photocells. Marry this girl and take her home to your hive. If your queen mother objects, refer her to, Potshelter here." He cut short the young people's thanks. "Just one thing," he said, wagging a finger at Rowe. "Don't written any more letters." "Why ever would I?" Richard answered. "Already my action is beginning to seem like a mad dream." "Not to me, dear," Jane corrected him. "Oh, sir, could I have the letter he sent me? Not to do anything with, not to show anyone, just to keep." "Well, I don't know," Crumbine began. "Oh, please, sir." "Well, I don't know why not, I was going to say. Here you are, miss. Just see that this husband of yours never writtens another." He turned back as the contracting door shut the young couple from view. "You were right, Potshelter," he said briskly. "It was one of those combinations of mischances that come up only once in a billion times. But we're going to have to issue recommendations for new procedures and safeguards that will reduce the possibilities to 1 in a trillion. It will undoubtedly up the Terran income tax a healthy percentage, but we can't have something like this happening again. Every boy must marry the girl next door, and the first-class males must not be interfered with. The advertising must go through." "I'd almost like to see it happen again," Potshelter murmured dreamily, "if there were another Jane Doe in it." Outside, Richard and Jane had halted to allow a small cortege of machines to pass. First came a squad of police machines with Black Sorter in their midst, unmuzzled and docile enough, though still gnashing his teeth softly. Then, stretched out horizontally and borne on the shoulders of grey psychiatrist, black coroner, white nursemaid 7 and greasy Joe, there passed the slim form of Pink Wastebasket, snow white in death. The machines were keening softly, mournfully. Round about the black pillars, little Mecco mops were scurrying like mice, cleaning up the last of the first-class male bits of confetti. Richard winced at this evidence of his aberration, but Jane squeezed his hand comfortingly, which produced in him a truly amazing sensation that changed his whole appearance. "I know how you feel, darling," she told him, "but don't worry about it. Just think, dear, I'll always be able to tell your friends' wives something no other woman in the world can boast of, that my husband once wrote me a letter." A Fall of Glass by Stanley R. Lee. Narrated by William Skye. The weatherman was always right. Temperature 59, humidity 47%. Occasional light showers. But of what? The pockets of Mr. Humphrey Fowndes were being picked outrageously. It was a splendid day. The temperature was a crisp 59 degrees, the humidity a mildly desiccated 47%. The sun was a flaming orange ball in a cloudless blue sky. His pockets were picked 11 times. It should have been difficult. Under the circumstances, it was a masterpiece of pocket-picking. What made it possible was Humphrey Founds's abstraction. He was an uncommonly preoccupied individual. He was strolling along a quiet residential avenue, small private houses, one after another, a place of little traffic and minimum distractions. But he was thinking about weather, which was an unusual subject to begin with for a person living in a domed city. He was thinking so deeply about it that it never occurred to him that entirely too many people were bumping into him. He was thinking about optimum dome conditions, a crisp 59 degrees, a mildly desiccated 47%, when a bogus postman, who pretended to be reading a postal card, jostled him. In the confusion of spilled letters and apologies from both sides, the postman rifled Founds's handkerchief and inside jacket pockets. He was still thinking about temperature and humidity when a pretty girl happened along with something in her eye. They collided. She got his right and left jacket pockets. It was much too much for coincidence. The sidewalk was wide enough to allow 4 people to pass at one time. He should surely have become suspicious when 2 men engaged in a heated argument came along. In the ensuing contretemps, they emptied his rear pants pockets, got his wristwatch, and restored the contents of the handkerchief pocket. It all went off very smoothly, like a game of put and take, the sole difference being that Humphrey Founds had no idea he was playing. There was an occasional tinkle of falling glass. It fell on the streets and houses, making small geysers of shiny mist, hitting with a gentle musical sound, like the ephemeral droppings of a celesta. It was precipitation peculiar to a dome, feather-light fragments showering harmlessly on the city from time to time. Dome weevils, their metal arms reaching out with molten glass, roamed the huge casserole, ceaselessly patching and repairing. Humphrey Founds strode through the puffs of falling glass, still intrigued by a temperature that was always 59 degrees, by a humidity that was always 47%, by weather that was always optimum. It was this rather than skill that enabled the police to maintain such a tight surveillance on him, a surveillance that went to the extent of getting his fingerprints off the postman's bag, and which photographed, x-rayed, and chemically analysed the contents of his pockets before returning them. 2 blocks away from his home, a careless housewife spilled a 5-pound bag of flour as he was passing. It was really plaster of Paris. He left his shoe prints, stride measurement, height, weight, and handedness behind. By the time Founds reached his front door, an entire dossier complete with photographs had been prepared and was being read by 2 men in an orange patrol car parked down the street. Lanfier had undoubtedly been affected by his job. Sitting behind the wheel of the orange car, he watched Humphrey Founds approach with a distinct feeling of admiration, although it was an odd, objective kind of admiration, clinical in nature. It was similar to that of a pathologist observing for the first time a new and particularly virulent strain of pneumococcus under his microscope. Lanfier's job was to ferret out aberration. It couldn't be tolerated within the confines of a dome. Conformity had become more than a social force, it was a physical necessity. And after years of working at it, Lanfier had become an admirer of eccentricity. He came to see that genuine quirks were rare, and as time went on, due partly to his own small efforts, rarer. Founds was a masterpiece of queerness. He was utterly inexplicable. Lanfier was almost proud of Humphrey Founds. "Sometimes his house shakes," Lanfier said. "House shakes," Lieutenant McBride wrote in his notebook. Then he stopped and frowned. He reread what he'd just written. "You heard right. The house shakes," Lanfier said, savouring it. McBride looked at the Founds house through the magnifying glass of the windshield. "Like from side to side?" he asked in a somewhat patronising tone of voice. "And up and down." McBride returned the notebook to the breast pocket of his orange uniform. Go on, he said, amused. It sounds interesting. He tossed the dossier carelessly on the back seat. Lanfear sat stiffly behind the wheel, affronted. The cynical McBride couldn't really appreciate fine aberrations. In some ways, McBride was a barbarian. Lanfear had held out on Founds for months. He had even contrived to engage him in conversation once, a pleasantly absurd, irrational little chat that titillated him for weeks. It was only with the greatest reluctance that he finally mentioned Founds to McBride. After years of searching for differences, Lanfear had seen how extraordinarily repetitious people were, echoes really, dimly resounding echoes, each believing itself whole and separate. They spoke in an incessant chatter of clichés, and their actions were unbelievably trite. Then a fine, robust freak came along, and the others, the echoes, refused to believe it. The lieutenant was probably on the point of suggesting a vacation. "Why don't you take a vacation?" Lieutenant McBride suggested. "It's like this, McBride. Do you know what a wind is? A breeze? A zephyr?" "I've heard some." "They say there are mountain tops where winds blow all the time. Strong winds, McBride. Winds like you and I can't imagine. And if there was a house sitting on such a mountain, and if winds did blow, it would shake exactly the way that one does. Sometimes I get the feeling the whole place is going to slide off its foundation and go sailing down the avenue." Lieutenant McBride pursed his lips. "I'll tell you something else," Lanfear went on. "The windows all close at the same time. You'll be watching, and all of a sudden every single window in the place will drop to its sill." Lanfear leaned back in the seat, his eyes still on the house. "Sometimes I think there's a whole crowd of people in there waiting for a signal, as if they all had something important to say, but had to close the windows first so no one could hear. Why else close the windows in a domed city? And then, as soon as the place is buttoned up, they all explode into conversation, and that's why the house shakes." McBride whistled. "No, I don't need a vacation." A falling piece of glass dissolved into a puff of gossamer against the windshield. Lanfear started and bumped his knee on the steering wheel. "No, you don't need a rest," McBride said. "You're starting to see flying houses, hear loud babbling voices. You've got winds in your brain, Lanfear, breezes of fatigue, zephyrs of irrationality." At that moment, all at once, every last window in the house slammed shut. The street was deserted and quiet, not a movement, not a sound. McBride and Lanfear both leaned forward, as if waiting for the ghostly babble of voices to commence. The house began to shake. It rocked from side to side, it pitched forward and back, it yawed and dipped and twisted, straining at the mooring of its foundation. The house could have been preparing to take off and sail down the... McBride looked at Lanfear, and Lanfear looked at McBride, and then they both looked back at the dancing house. "And the water," Lanfear said. "The water he uses. He could be the thirstiest and cleanest man in the city. He could have a whole family of thirsty and clean kids, and he still wouldn't need all that water." The lieutenant had picked up the dossier. He thumbed through the pages now in amazement. "Where do you get a guy like this?" he asked. "Did you see what he carries in his pockets?" "And compasses won't work on this street." The lieutenant lit a cigarette and sighed. He usually sighed when making the decision to raid a dwelling. It expressed his weariness and distaste for people who went off and got neurotic when they could be enjoying a happy, normal existence. There was something implacable about his sighs. "He'll be coming out soon," Lanfear said. "He eats supper next door with a widow. Then he goes to the library. Always the same. Supper at widow's next door, and then the library." McBride's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. "The library?" he said. "Is he in with that bunch?" Lanfear nodded. "Should be very interesting," McBride said slowly. "I can't wait to see what he's got in there," Lanfear murmured, watching the house with a consuming interest. They sat there smoking in silence, and every now and then their eyes widened as the house danced a new step. Found stopped on the porch to brush the plaster of Paris off his shoes. He hadn't seen the patrol car, and this intense preoccupation of his was also responsible for the dancing house. He simply hadn't noticed. There was a certain amount of vibration, of course. He had a bootleg pipe connected into the dome blower system, and the high-pressure air caused some buffeting against the thin walls of the house. At least he'd called it buffeting. He'd never thought to watch from outside. He went in and threw his jacket on the sofa, there being no room left in the closets. Crossing the living room, he stopped to twist a drawer pull. Every window slammed shut. Tight as a kite, he thought, satisfied. He continued on toward the closet at the foot of the stairs and then stopped again. Was that right? No, snug as a hug in a rug, he went on, thinking. The old devils. The downstairs closet was like a great watch case, a profusion of wheels surrounding the master mechanism, which was a miniature seesaw that went back and forth 365¼ times an hour. The wheels had a curious stateliness about them. They were all quite old, salvaged from grandfather's clocks and music boxes, and they went around in graceful circles at the rate of 30 and 31 times an hour, although there was one slightly eccentric cam that vacillated between 28 and 29. He watched as they spun and flashed in the darkness, and then set them for 7 o'clock in the evening, April 7th, any year. Outside, the domed city vanished. It was replaced by an illusion, or, as Founds hoped it might appear, the illusion of the domed city vanished and was replaced by a more satisfactory, and for his specific purpose, more functional illusion. Looking through the window, he saw only a garden. Instead of an orange sun at perpetual high noon, there was a red sun setting brilliantly, marred only by an occasional arc-over, which left the smell of ozone in the air. There was also a gigantic moon. It hid a huge area of sky, and it sang. The sun and moon both looked down upon a garden that was itself scintillant, composed largely of neon roses. Moonlight, he thought, and roses. Satisfactory. And cocktails for two. Blast, he'd never been able to figure that one out. He watched as the moon played Oh You Beautiful Doll and the neon roses flashed slowly from red to violet, then went back to the closet and turned on the scent. The house began to smell like an immensely concentrated rose as the moon shifted to People Will Say We're in Love. He rubbed his chin critically. It seemed all right. A dreamy sunset, an enchanted moon, flowers, scent. They were all purely speculative, of course. He had no idea how a rose really smelled, or looked for that matter. Not to mention a moon. But then neither did the widow. He'd have to be confident, assertive. Insist on it. I tell you, my dear, this is a genuine, realistic, romantic moon. Now, does it do anything to your pulse? Do you feel icy fingers marching up and down your spine? His own spine didn't seem to be affected. But then he hadn't read that book on ancient Moors and courtship customs. How really odd the ancients were. Seduction seemed to be an incredibly long and drawn-out process, accompanied by a considerable amount of falsification. Communication seemed virtually impossible. No meant any number of things depending on the tone of voice and the circumstances. It could mean yes, it could mean ask me again later on this evening. He went up the stairs to the bedroom closet and tried the rainmaker, thinking roguishly, Thou shalt not inundate. The risks he was taking. A shower fell gently on the garden, and a male chorus began to chant Singing in the Rain. Undiminished, the yellow moon and the red sun continued to be brilliant, although the sun occasionally arced over and demolished several of the neon roses. The last wheel in the bedroom closet was a rather elegant steering wheel from an old 1995 Studebaker. This was on the bootleg pipe. He gingerly turned it. Far below, in the cellar, there was a rumble, and then the soft whistle of winds came to him. He went downstairs to watch out the living room window. This was important. The window had a really fixed attitude about air currents. The neon roses bent and tickled against each other as the wind rose, and the moon shook a trifle as it whispered, "Cuddle up a little closer." He watched with folded arms, considering how he would start. "My dear Mrs. de Chazouet." Too formal. They'd be looking out at the romantic garden. Time to be a bit forward. "My very dear Mrs. de Chazouet." No, contrived. How about a simple, "Dear Mrs. de Chazouet"? That might be it. "I was wondering, seeing as how it's so late, if you wouldn't rather stay over instead of going home." Preoccupied, he hadn't noticed the winds building up, didn't hear the shaking and rattling of the pipes. There were attic pipes connected to wall pipes, and wall pipes connected to cellar pipes, and they made one gigantic skeleton that began to rattle its bones and dance as high-pressure air from the dome blower rushed in, slowly opening the Studebaker valve wider and wider. The neon roses thrashed about, extinguishing each other. The red sun shot off a mass of sparks, and then quickly sank out of sight. The moon fell on the garden and rolled ponderously along, crooning, "When the blue of the night meets the gold of the day." The shaking house finally woke him up. He scrambled upstairs to the Studebaker wheel and shut it off. At the window again, he sighed. Repairs were in order. And it wasn't the first time the winds got out of line. Why didn't she marry him and save all this bother? He shut it all down and went out the front door, wondering about the rhyme of the months, about stately August and eccentric February and romantic April. April. Its days were 30 and it followed September. And all the rest have 31. What a strange people, the ancients. He still didn't see the orange car parked down the street. "Men are too perishable," Mrs. de Chazouet said over dinner. "For all practical purposes, I'm never going to marry again. All my husbands die." "Would you pass the beets, please?" Humphrey Fownes said. She handed him a platter of steaming red beets. "And don't look at me that way," she said. "I'm not going to marry you, and if you want reasons, I'll give you 4 of them. Andrew, Kurt, Norman, and Alphonse." The widow was a passionate woman. She did everything passionately, talking, cooking, dressing. Her beets were passionately red. Her clothes rustled and her high heels clicked and her jewellery tinkled. She was possessed by an uncontrollable dynamism. Fownes had never known anyone like her. "You forgot to put salt on the potatoes," she said passionately, then went on as calmly as it was possible for her to be, to explain why she couldn't marry him. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? They're all saying I'm a cannibal. I rob my husbands of their life force, and when they're empty, I carry their bodies outside on my way to the justice of the peace." "As long as there are people," he said philosophically, "there'll be talk." "But it's the air. Why don't they talk about that? The air is stale, I'm positive. It's not nourishing. The air is stale, and Andrew, Kurt, Norman, and Alphonse couldn't stand it. Poor Alphonse. He was never so healthy as on the day he was born. From then on, things got steadily worse for him." "I don't seem to mind the air." She threw up her hands. "You'd be the worst of the lot." She left the table, rustling and tinkling about the room. "I can just hear them. Try some of the asparagus. 5, that's what they'd say. That woman did it again. And the plain fact is, I don't want you on my record." "Really?" Fownes protested. "I feel splendid. Never better." He could hear her moving about and then felt her hands on his shoulders. "And what about those very elaborate plans you've been making to seduce me?" Fownes froze with 3 asparagus hanging from his fork. "Don't you think they'll find out? I found out, and you can bet they will. It's my fault, I guess. I talk too much, and I don't always tell the truth. To be completely honest with you, Mr. Fownes, it wasn't the old customs at all standing between us. It was air. I can't have another man die on me. It's bad for my self-esteem. And now you've gone and done something good and criminal, something peculiar. Founds put his fork down. Dear Mrs. de Chazouet, he started to say. And of course, when they do find out and they ask you why, Mr. Founds, you'll tell them. No heroics, please. When they ask a man a question, he always answers, and you will too. You'll tell them I wanted to be courted, and when they hear that, they'll be around to ask me a few questions. You see, we're both a bit queer. I hadn't thought of that, Founds said quietly. Oh, it doesn't really matter. I'll join Andrew, Kurt, Norman. That won't be necessary, Founds said with unusual force. With all due respect to Andrew, Kurt, Norman, and Alphonse, I might as well state here and now I have other plans for you, Mrs. de Chazouet. But my dear Mr. Founds, she said, leaning across the table, we're lost, you and I. Not if we could leave the dome, Founds said quietly. That's impossible. How? In no hurry, now that he had the widow's complete attention, Founds leaned across the table and whispered, Fresh air, Mrs. de Chazouet. Space. Miles and miles of space where the real estate monopoly has no control whatever. Where the wind blows across prairies. Or is it the other way round? No matter. How would you like that, Mrs. de Chazouet? Breathing somewhat faster than usual, the widow rested her chin on her two hands. Pray continue, she said. Endless vistas of moonlight and roses. April showers, Mrs. de Chazouet. And June, which, as you know, follows directly upon April and is supposed to be the month of brides, of marrying. June also lies beyond the dome. I see. And, Mr. Founds added, his voice a honeyed whisper, they say that somewhere out in the space and the roses and the moonlight, the sleeping equinox yawns and rises because on a certain day it's vernal, and that's when it roams the open country where geigers no longer scintillate. My! Mrs. de Chazouet rose, paced slowly to the window, and then came back to the table, standing directly over Founds. If you can get us outside the dome, she said, out where a man stays warm long enough for his wife to get to know him, if you can do that, Mr. Founds, you may call me Agnes. When Humphrey Founds stepped out of the widow's house, there was a look of such intense abstraction on his features that Lanfear felt a wistful desire to get out of the car and walk along with the man. It would be such a deliciously insane experience. April has 30 days, Founds mumbled, passing them, because 30 is the largest number such that all smaller numbers not having a common divisor with it are primes. MacBride frowned and added it to the dossier. Lanfear sighed. Pinning his hopes on the movement, Founds went straight to the library several blocks away, a shattered, depressing place given over to government publications and censored old books with holes in them. It was used so infrequently that the movement was able to meet there undisturbed. The librarian was a yellowed, dog-eared woman of 80. She spent her days reading ancient library cards and, like the books around her, had been rendered by Time's own censor into near unintelligibility. Here's one, she said to him as he entered. Gulliver's Travels, loaned to John Wesley Davidson on March 14th, 1979 for 5 days. What do you make of it? In the litter of books and cards and dried-out ink pads that surrounded the librarian, Founds noticed a torn dust jacket with a curious illustration. What's that? He said. A twister, she replied quickly. Now listen to this. 7 years later, on March 21st, 1986, Ella Marshall Davidson took out the same book. What do you make of that? I'd say, Humphrey Founds said, that he recommended it to her, that one day they met in the street and he told her about this book and then they went to the library together and she borrowed it and eventually they got married. Ha! They were brother and sister, the librarian shouted in her parched voice, her old buckram eyes laughing with cunning. Founds smiled weakly and looked again at the dust jacket. The twister was unquestionably a meteorological phenomenon. It spun ominously like a malevolent top and coursed the countryside destructively, carrying a Dorothy to an Oz. He couldn't help wondering if twisters did anything to feminine pulses, if they could possibly be a part of a moonlit night with cocktails and roses. He absently stuffed the dust jacket in his pocket and went on into the other rooms, the librarian mumbling after him. Edna Murdoch Featherstone, April 21st, 1991, as though reading inscriptions on a tombstone. The movement met in what had been the children's room, where unpaid ladies of the afternoon had once upon a time read stories to other people's offspring. The members sat around at the miniature tables looking oddly like giants fled from their fairy tales, protesting. Where did the old society fail? The leader was demanding of them. He stood in the centre of the room leaning on a heavy knobbed cane. He glanced around at the group almost complacently and waited as Humphrey Founds squeezed into an empty chair. We live in a dome, the leader said, for lack of something. An invention. What is the one thing that the great technological societies before ours could not invent, notwithstanding their various giant brains, electronic and otherwise? Founds was the kind of man who never answered a rhetorical question. He waited, uncomfortable in the tight chair, while the others struggled with this problem in revolutionary dialectics. A sound foreign policy, the leader said, aware that no one else had obtained the insight. If a sound foreign policy can't be created, the only alternative is not to have any foreign policy at all. Thus the movement into domes began, by common consent of the governments. This is known as self-containment. Dialectically out in left field, Humphrey Founds waited for a lull in the ensuing discussion, and then politely inquired how it might be arranged for him to get out. Out? The leader said, frowning. Out where? Outside the dome. Oh, all in good time, my friend. One day we shall all pick up and leave. And that day I'll await impatiently, Founds replied with marvellous tact, because it will be lonely out there for the two of us. My future wife and I have to leave now. Nonsense. Ridiculous. You have to be prepared for the open country. You can't just up and leave. It would be suicide, Founds, and dialectically very poor. Then you have discussed preparations, the practical necessities of life in the open country. Food, clothing, a weapon perhaps. What else? Have I left anything out? The leader sighed. The gentleman wants to know if he's left anything out, he said to the group. Founds looked around at them, at some dozen pained expressions. Tell the man what he's forgotten, the leader said, walking to the far window and turning his back quite pointedly on them. Everyone spoke at the same moment. A sound foreign policy, they all said, it being almost too obvious for words. On his way out, the librarian shouted at him, A tale of a tub, 35 years overdue. She was calculating the fine as he closed the door. Humphrey Founds's preoccupation finally came to an end when he was 1 block away from his house. It was then that he realized something unusual must have occurred. An orange patrol car of the security police was parked at his front door, and something else was happening too. His house was dancing. It was disconcerting and at the same time enchanting to watch one's residence frisking about on its foundation. It was such a strange sight that for the moment he didn't give a thought to what might be causing it. But when he stepped gingerly onto the porch, which was doing its own independent gavotte, he reached for the doorknob with an immense curiosity. The door flung itself open and knocked him back off the porch. From a prone position on his minuscule front lawn, Founds watched as his favourite easy chair sailed out of the living room on a blast of cold air and went pinwheeling down the avenue in the bright sunshine. A wild wind and a thick fog poured out of the house. It brought chairs, suits, small tables, lamps trailing their cords, ashtrays, sofa cushions. The house was emptying itself fiercely, as if disgorging an old spoiled meal. From deep inside he could hear the rumble of his ancient upright piano as it rolled ponderously from room to room. He stood up. A wet wind swept over him, whipping at his face, toying with his hair. It was a whistling in his ears and a tingle on his cheeks. He got hit by a shoe. As he forced his way back to the doorway, needles of rain played over his face, and he heard a voice cry out from somewhere in the living room. "Help!" Lieutenant McBride called. Standing in the doorway with his wet hair plastered down on his dripping scalp, the wind roaring about him, the piano rumbling in the distance like thunder, Humphrey Found suddenly saw it all very clearly. "Winds," he said in a whisper. "What's happening?" McBride yelled, crouching behind the sofa. "March winds," he said. "What?" "April showers." The winds roared for a moment, and then McBride's lost voice emerged from the blackness of the living room. "These are not optimum dome conditions," the voice wailed. "The temperature is not 59 degrees. The humidity is not 47%. Founds held his face up to let the rain fall on it. "Moonlight," he shouted. "Roses! My soul for a cocktail for two!" He grasped the doorway to keep from being blown out of the house. "Are you going to make it stop or aren't you?" McBride yelled. "You'll have to tell me what you did first." "I told him not to touch that wheel. Lanfear, he's in the upstairs bedroom." When he heard this, Founds plunged into the house and fought his way up the stairs. He found Lanfear standing outside the bedroom with a wheel in his hand. "What have I done?" Lanfear asked in the monotone of shock. Founds took the wheel. It was off a 1995 Studebaker. "I'm not sure what's going to come of this," he said to Lanfear with an astonishing amount of objectivity. "But the entire dome air supply is now coming through my bedroom." The wind screamed. "Is there something I can turn?" Lanfear asked. "Not any more, there isn't." They started down the stairs carefully, but the wind caught them and they quickly reached the bottom in a wet heap. Recruiting Lieutenant McBride from behind his sofa, the men carefully edged out of the house and forced the front door shut. The wind died. The fog dispersed. They stood dripping in the optimum dome conditions of the bright avenue. "I never figured on this," Lanfear said, shaking his head. With the front door closed, the wind quickly built up inside the house. They could see the furnishing whirl past the windows. The house did a wild, elated jig. "What kind of place is this?" McBride said, his courage beginning to return. He took out his notebook, but it was a soggy mess. He tossed it away. "Sure, he was different," Lanfear murmured. "I knew that much." When the roof blew off, they weren't really surprised. With a certain amount of equanimity, they watched it lift off almost gracefully, standing on end for a moment before toppling to the ground. It was strangely slow motion, as was the black, twirling cloud that now rose out of the master bedroom, spewing shorts and socks and cases every which way. "Now what?" McBride said, thoroughly exasperated, as this strange black cloud began to accelerate, whirling about like some malevolent top. Humphrey Founds took out the dust jacket he'd found in the library. He held it up and carefully compared the spinning cloud in his bedroom with the illustration. The cloud rose and spun, assuming the identical shape of the illustration. "It's a twister," he said softly. "A Kansas twister." "What?" McBride asked, his bravado slipping away again. "What is a twister?" The twister roared and moved out of the bedroom, out over the rear of the house toward the side of the dome. "It says here," Founds shouted over the roaring, "that Dorothy travelled from Kansas to Oz in a twister, and that Oz is a wonderful and mysterious land beyond the confines of everyday living." McBride's eyes and mouth were great zeros. "Is there something I can turn?" Lanfear asked. Huge chunks of glass began to fall around them. "Founds!" McBride shouted. "This is a direct order. Make it go back!" But Founds had already begun to run on toward the next house, dodging mountainous puffs of glass as he went. "Mrs. de Chazouet!" he shouted. "Yoo-hoo, Mrs. de Chazouet!" The dome weevils were going berserk trying to keep up with the precipitation. They whirred back and forth at frightful speed, then, emptied of molten glass, rushed to the trough which they quickly emptied, and then rushed about empty-handed. "Yoo-hoo!" he yelled, running. The artificial sun vanished behind the mushrooming twister. Optimum temperature collapsed. "Mrs. de Chazouet! Agnes! Will you marry me? Yoo-hoo!" Lanfier and Lieutenant McBride leaned against their car and waited, dazed. There was quite a large fall of glass. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button so this video can spread to more people. Thanks. Easy Does It by E. G. von Wald. Narrated by William Skye. Hal was stranded in the wilderness with a beautiful girl, and it was surprisingly enjoyable while his conditioning was off. But after all, how uncivilized can one get? Hal Weber leaned back in the soft form-air executive seat. Although he twisted and shifted his position restlessly, he received the same sensation of perfect, comfortable support no matter which way he sat in it. Which was only natural, of course. Form-air was the best suspend-field furniture manufactured. As he squirmed about, he had a faint, puzzled frown on his face, and in his stomach he felt a lurking sensation of unaccustomed tension. Hal simply could not understand it. There was a faint humming sound as the door panel slid back. His father entered the office. "Well, Hal," the old man murmured softly with a placid smile of satisfaction, "we've done it." "Done what? Oh, you mean the new coloration process?" "Yes, it will quintuple the net value of the family fortune within a year. We may be the richest people in the world then." "That's nice," Hal said mildly. His father flicked a finger across a sensitive spot on the front of the desk and relaxed as a perfect form-air attendant's chair sprang into existence to fit his gross, soft body. "Yes, indeed," he said with a mild sigh. "It's been a long, long time that we've been working for that. Worked mighty hard, too." "That's right," murmured Hal, a little more forcefully than necessary. "Splendid." His father's eyebrows rose at the unusual emphasis, but he was much too cultured to question the point. He continued along the lines of conversation already started. "We'll have to do something for Bruckner. He has been of tremendous assistance on that project. Did it practically all by himself. He is a very intelligent man, even if he is an outlander." "Bruckner," said Hal with mild irritation. "All I hear around here lately is Bruckner. What is he anyway? Nothing but a savage." "Eh?" said his father softly, raising his eyebrows again in polite inquiry. "If Bruckner is such a brilliant fellow, why doesn't he take the treatment and become civilized? I sometimes get a little tired of an employee who tells me I'm wrong all the time." "But he is almost always right when he makes such statements, Hal," Weber pointed out mildly. "For instance, just the other day I asked him about the color range to be used with the new process on the form-air sky dome. He stated flatly that blue was a normal color for sky. Just like that. I was a little startled, of course, at his lack of courtesy, but after I thought it over a while, blue did seem to be a nice color for sky." "Ah, blue," Hal muttered. "What's wrong with the green we've always used in the past?" Mr. Weber sighed and squirmed a little to get the chair into a more comfortable fit. Attendants' chairs were not quite as comfortable as the executive type, even if they were form-air. Then he cocked an eyebrow and looked at his son with mild concern. "Hal, my boy, what's the trouble? I've never seen you so completely upset in all my life." "I feel funny," murmured Hal. As a matter of fact, I feel awful. Maybe there's some connection." "Ill," the old man nodded agreeably. "Yes, I thought you looked it when I came in here. Something in the set of your mouth. Tight, sort of." With an expression of mild surprise, Hal reached up and tentatively felt around his mouth with a cleanly manicured forefinger. "Son," Weber murmured, "how long has it been since you had your last CZ treatment?" 8 years, Hal admitted. "It's a little overdue, I suppose, but surely—" His voice trailed off softly as his mind seized upon the possibility. "That's probably what it is," Weber replied. That was a pretty definite statement for someone to make about another's sensations, but anyone could see that the old man was concerned over his son. 5 years is the standard period at your age. Why haven't you taken it?" "Well, you know," Hal whispered. "It's that new thing they have in it now." "Ah," said his father with comprehension. "That's right, I forgot all about that. A change. But you won't mind. Really, you won't. You just think you will." "Perhaps so," Hal said, and hastily changed the subject of conversation to a less depressing topic. "The new coloration process is a real success, you say?" "Absolutely. We can now provide flexible hue and chroma for the complete Form Air line, air chair, air cab, and air dome. We'll be the only one who has it, and since every proprietor on the planet will want our new equipment as fast as we turn it out, we'll put every other firm completely out of the business. I've already worked out a method so that we can convert to export goods too, without waiting for the economic balance to be readjusted. Of course, the colonies will have to curtail a little, but we don't have to concern ourselves with them." "Yes," agreed Hal. "Bruckner has been very useful to us on it," the old man repeated again. "We'll have to show him we appreciate it." Hal's mouth tightened just perceptibly at the mention of the redoubtable engineer, but he said nothing. His father continued in his soft, mild voice. "We must make him a present of something. Should it be money? Can't give him property, of course, because he isn't a citizen." "I don't like the idea of giving an outlander money. They get their allotments, and that's enough wealth. If you give them money, they will be able to buy more than their allotment, and that could very easily upset our own economic balance, you know." "Quite true," Weber agreed. Then he smiled with placid inspiration. "I know. We'll give him fame. We'll name the process after him." "Well," Hal said doubtfully, "I guess that would do it." "I think so. He's been a great help. As a matter of fact, though, most of the Outlanders are helpful. A pity they won't take the treatments and become citizens. It seems sort of sad the way their emotions cut them up at times. Like old Tannen last month. Why, up to then he was almost like a civilized man, even without the treatments." "I know," Hal said tonelessly. "It was his son, wasn't it?" "Yes. Curious that the old man should be so concerned over that little unpleasantness. So his son did get a little excited and kill a proprietor and was executed himself. No reason for his father to carry on so about it, is there? I tried to get him to take the treatment then, but, well, after all, you can hardly expect an uncivilized outlander to appreciate the advantages, can you?" "No." Hal did not refer to the fact that the new element recently put into the standard CC treatment was causing him to postpone taking it himself, but his father seemed to sense his thought. "You won't mind it, son. Really, you won't. The treatment will take care of the whole thing. It's perfectly obvious that you are suffering from the effects of the delay right at this moment." "Oh, chaos," Hal swore softly. "Why did they have to go and put that element in anyway?" "Now, Hal, you know better than that," his father chided him gently. "It was either include a marital inclination or else go in for a complete program of artificial insemination. The women had a vote too, you know, and they wouldn't hear of it. They don't object to carrying a child for a few months, that's always been in their conditioning for some reason or another, but they insisted that if they had to be mothers, the men would have to be fathers. And they insisted on a standard civilized marriage contract to cover the situation. I know. I've heard all the arguments. Racial suicide and all. Nonsense. We can always import outlanders and force them to take the treatment. Outlanders, he pointed out with suitable mild cultured disgust, breed like animals. No, son, that wouldn't do the job. We have to keep the bloodline. Outlanders don't have it, you know. If they did, they would have permitted themselves to be civilized long ago. Hal's fingers drummed nervously on the desktop, and his father again raised an eyebrow in mild concern. He shook his head thoughtfully. Guiltily, Hal stopped his fingers from their satisfying tattoo. He bunched them into a fist instead, and then gazed at it with mild unbelief. "All right," he finally whispered. "This is simply awful. And it looks as if in order to be cured, I'll have to get me a wife along with it. A pity, though. Everything was perfectly mild without one." "You'll be mild with a wife, Hal," his father assured him softly. "You don't like the prospect now because it means change. Change, of course, is always unpleasant, but the treatment will take care of it all right. I know that I didn't expect things to work out so mildly with a wife. It was optional back in those days, and if it hadn't been for your mother's family money, I never would have married. Particularly her, with her family history of fecundity, as witnessed by the children we produced, you and your sister. But Formair needed the money, and I was the only available man in the Weber clan. When I agreed to make the sacrifice, they made me president of the firm, because it isn't often that a man will do so much for his own family. Shows real character. It's in the cultured family blood, naturally." Hal had heard all this many, many times before, but he listened without irritation. Or at least with only the mild irritation that was the result of his present unstable condition. "Yes, indeed," his father went on in his mild, comfortable voice. "Hardly knew she was around the house, though, once the treatment was over with. It was just as if she had been around all my life. Marvelous process." "All right," Hal murmured. "I'll take it." "Be a good idea to pick out a wife first. Sometimes there are a few minor adjustments to make because of outstanding individual characteristics. You get an absolutely perfect fit that way, you know." He stood up and walked toward the door, the flabby muscles of his body easily supporting the 2 pounds relative of his weight. "The Ansermet family has a female available, I believe," he murmured as he walked. "Excellent choice. But you better have the probability checked anyway." "I know about her," Hal replied thoughtfully. "But what's she like? Have you ever met her?" His father smiled benignly back at him as he practically floated through the doorway. "That doesn't matter a bit," he said mildly. "It doesn't make any difference at all what either of you are like. The treatment will bring you both back to absolute statistical normal, and you'll both be a perfect fit for each other. Quite pleasantly civilized." The door hummed shut behind him. "Well," Hal announced aloud to himself, "guess that's it." He ordered the automatic secretary to make all suitable arrangements and then stood up. He walked to the elevator where a soft hissing breeze conveyed his temporary 1/10 pound relative gently up the tube to the roof. There his weight returned to its normal 2 pounds relative and he spoke to the robot attendant. "My cab." His Formair air cab was promptly and quietly delivered and Hal stepped inside. "Destination?" a voice inquired softly from the control bank. "Take me to the nearest available civilization conditioning treatment center." At once, the cab took off. It was a silent and comfortable motion. Hal had always liked flying. The automatic pilot was speaking to him gently. "Central Authority advises that the nearest available CCT center at this time is in the metropolis of Knoxville. This requires traversing interurban wilderness. Hal frowned just slightly. He had never seen the interurban wilderness, of course, and had not the slightest desire to do so. That was chaos. He inquired, "How soon can the local centre take me?" 3 days, 7 hours, 20 minutes from reference time. Mark time, mark, the robot announced the temporal point of reference. Too long, Hal replied wearily. Let's go to Knoxville, and shut off all outside views. I do not wish to see the chaos. The air cab obediently turned and transposed through the suspend field of the York Metropolis Airdome. It was an effortless passing, since the field that constituted the wall structure of the air cab was exactly in phase with that of the airdrome field. Both were Form Air manufacture, of course. The pleasant, silent, effortless motion of the air cab soon produced its usual somnolent effect on him, and he dozed comfortably off. He slept the entire trip. At Knoxville, he spoke to the center technician briefly, advising the master robot of the possibility of his altered economic status, and the matter was thoroughly checked by the computer at Central Authority. Every conceivable source of psychosomatic tension and internal conflict was studied, and suitable alterations on Hal's master curve plotted. The process took 10 minutes while Hal dozed under the soothing warmth of the examination cap. There was a crackling buzz, and it was over. He woke immediately and felt wonderful. No tension, no irritation, not the slightest bit of his recent restlessness. Hal was delighted. On the way out of the cubicle, he encountered another proprietor and smiled at him with perfect civilized mildness. York, he ordered his air cab. Once again, the sleek button-shaped vehicle soared up through the airdome and out over the interurban wilderness. Hal contentedly went to sleep right in the middle of the pilot's automatic rundown of flight data. He was jolted awake by a raucous rattle from the control bank. Blinking his eyes sleepily, he said, "Please stop all that noise. What is the trouble?" A very unpleasant and notably ungentle voice replied. "Apologies, sir. We are out of control. Air crash has occurred." Air crash? An almost unheard of thing that sometimes happened to people who used inferior equipment like that produced by firms other than Form Air. People were even known to be killed by it. "Report," he said quietly, then flinched a little at the raucous scratching of the speech mechanism. "Reference point, mark. Altitude 11,371 feet. Velocity reduced to 209.9 miles per hour. Locus 700.8 miles from nearest civilized metropolis, which is York." The voice continued, but became unintelligible as the mangled circuits faltered. 700 miles from civilization. Wilderness. Chaos. That settled it, of course. Hal smiled gently as he realized that he was about to die. A civilized man obviously could not be expected to survive in chaos. He observed that he was breathing more strenuously and realized that it was the result of the rapid failure of the anti-gravity field. Never in his life had Hal been under the full force of the Earth's mass field, but he knew the symptoms. Once he had been exposed to a 1/2 G for a few hours. Very unpleasant, he recalled. The automatic pilot's unintelligible speech suddenly stopped altogether. There was a heavy, awkward lurch that threw Hal forward against the front panel. But before he struck it, the field generator failed completely, the panel ceased to exist, and Hal was flying through the air. He shut his eyes and placidly waited for death. A moment later, he hit the ground sharply, rolled over and over, and lay still. He sighed heavily. Death? He had always fancied that death would be a complete absence of sensation and no consciousness of effort whatever. Instead, his breath was coming in deep, heavy sighs, his head hurt, his arm was aching, and something was tickling his nose. "Come on, wake up," a voice said briskly. Hal opened his eyes and looked up at a golden-framed face. It was the face that had been speaking, and the pleasingly shaped lips now moved again. "You aren't hurt, you know, just a little shaken up." Hal continued to stare at the woman for a moment, then muttered, "Oomph," and struggled to a sitting posture. It was a great effort in the unaccustomed full-Earth gravitational field. The woman was an outlander, no doubt about it. That was evident from her highly spirited tone of voice. But as Hal looked around at the strange picture of undisturbed interurban wilderness, he found that most astonishingly he did not mind it. As a matter of fact, he rather liked her tone of voice. It was all very puzzling. "What happened?" he muttered heavily, his eyes moving back to the landscape and the small metal boxes which housed the now defunct suspend field generators. "There must have been something wrong with your air cab," she replied. "You crashed, the same way I did a couple days ago." The woman walked over to the generator boxes, picked them up and brought them back to where he was still sitting on the grass. "We'll need these," she explained. "There are emergency supplies inside them." Hal didn't move. She waited a moment, then said lightly, tossing her golden hair, "Come along now. We're way out in the wilderness, you know, and there aren't any robots to bring us our dinner." "Wilderness," Hal murmured. "That's right. Well, I guess we'll die here." "Oh, nonsense!" She stamped her foot with impatience. "This would have to happen to me. Of all people to be stranded within the wilderness, I have to get one of you insipid, gutless proprietors." "Oh, yes," Hal said with unconscious anger, lurching to his feet. "Who is insipid and gutless? I'm considerably more civilized than you are." Quick surprise crossed her face as she listened. Hal continued his angry speech. "Why is it that all you savages always think you know how to live better than your superiors? If you are so clever, why aren't you civilized?" "Well, listen to him. You sound almost human." She was laughing at him. "Damned savage," he growled. He turned and strode purposefully away from her across the soft matting of grass. "Where do you think you are going?" she called. "Away from here," he replied, but the rapid pace in the unaccustomed gravity was very quickly taking his energy. His breath came in deep, laboured gasps already, and he could scarcely move his feet. He stopped abruptly and looked at the distant horizon. There was nothing in sight that indicated civilization. These regions had not been inhabited for 250 years, ever since the severance of the planetary colonies from political control by the motherland and the settling of the proprietors into their well-separated civilized cities. The land was all owned by the proprietors, but was unnecessary and hence not used. He felt a light touch on his arm. "I'm sorry," she apologized softly. "I can understand you a little, but you're so completely under the influence of your horrible personality conditioning methods that you can't possibly understand me." "Who's under what influence?" Hal said in a valiant attempt to express his irritation, but his voice held the obvious weakness of fatigue. "You poor boy," she sympathized. "You don't sound very much influenced by it right now." At her words, Hal suddenly became aware of the unaccustomed vigour of his own emotions, and he was puzzled by it. But it seemed oddly unimportant for some reason. "How come you can handle this awful weight so easily?" he asked her. Her laughter was light and delightful. "We spend most of our lives under natural conditions, not under an anti-gravity machine. I've only been on Earth for a few months, visiting my father, but a lot of that time was spent out here in this beautiful wilderness." "Horrible chaos," he muttered. He glanced up and observed a mild, blue, cloud-studded sky. "Why, it is blue after all, isn't it?" "What's blue?" "The sky dome." She glanced up thoughtfully. "Of course it's blue. And this is not one of your artificial skies. This is the real thing. There's no artificial weather control out here, you know. You get natural sunlight, natural winds, storms, rain, oh, lots of things." Gah, said Hal. What makes you surprised at finding that the sky is blue? Probably because I never saw it before. The only time I ever heard of its being anything other than green was when an engineer we have working for us at the factory said it was blue. Well, never mind the sky. Let's find some place where we can get a little shelter for the night. She began to lead him slowly along an animal trail to a cluster of trees on a nearby stream. She walked with the obviously delayed pace one takes with invalids, but Hal had a difficult time keeping up. Finally, she said, Here's a pretty good place. Sit down next to that tree. You must be worn out. Ugh, he groaned, reclining back against a broad, rough oak trunk, then stiffening painfully away from it again. It doesn't fit, he mourned plaintively. Now you're sounding silly again, she scolded. Go on, lean back. There aren't any suspend field lounges out here for you, so you take what you get. Obediently, he relaxed against the rough, twisting bark. He was very, very tired. On second thought, even this rugged seat was comfortable. He sighed heavily and then looked pensively around again. Oh well, what does it matter? We'll be dead soon. Don't talk like that, she snapped with annoyance. Why? He inquired listlessly. Everybody knows a civilized human being can't possibly survive in the wilderness. That's why no one ever comes here. And I'd just as soon die right now if you have anything suitable for killing. The woman stared at him with a tight frown between her eyebrows. Then she shook her head with wonder. How you people can call yourselves civilized is beyond me. You yourself don't seem so bad, except that you don't have any guts. They've trained it all out by now. Please, begged Hal. You sound like that uncouth engineer that works for us. Impertinent. That what engineer? She demanded spiritedly. Who are you anyway? I'm Weber, Hal Weber. The engineer is a savage. Oh, sorry, he smiled weakly. You're a savage too. Guess you Outlanders don't regard yourselves as such. No, we don't, she snapped. And if it weren't for us, you silly fools here on Earth would have died out long ago. Outlanders are noted for their misplaced pride, of course, Hal commented with a mildness that was impelled by fatigue rather than civilized conditioning. Oh, are we now? She said angrily, standing up and bending over him. And who do you think you are, Lord Proprietor? Some humble god, perhaps? Let me tell you something, Hal Weber. I've heard about you. You know who I am? My name is Lois Bruckner. That uncouth engineer you just referred to happens to be my father. Hal was puzzled. What on earth is the matter? He asked. Why are you so excited? You called my father uncouth. Why get excited about that? After all, Hal gestured weakly, trying to reason with her. It's only your father. I didn't say you were uncouth. Funny thing is, I like you. Suppose I called your father names, she demanded, her lower lip protruding belligerently. You can call him anything you like as far as I'm concerned. Lois Bruckner stood there a moment, her mouth open in astonishment. Then she sat down beside him again quietly. That's right, she murmured. They even educate love out of you. Hal sighed heavily and slid away from the tree onto the rough, rocky ground. It was painful, but he was so tired. His breath came in regular, deep sighs as he went to sleep. By the time he woke, Lois had constructed a kind of primitive lean-to shelter over him. Hal was amazed. The sheltering purpose of the structure was evident to him, and he was startled that she should have been able to design such a thing on the spur of the moment. She heard him stir and looked up from the fire she had built in front of the lean-to. Hungry? She asked. He was ravenous, but his muscles ached in every fibre. His wonder at her cleverness disappeared abruptly when he tried to move. He rolled over, groaning and helpless. Immediately she was at his side, pushing him back onto the bed of dry, fragrant grass she had put him on. "Now don't try to move around," she admonished. "Just a few days and you'll be all right." "Oh," Hal groaned. "This is awful." There, she murmured solicitously. "I've made you some soup. You'll like it." "Soup?" he groaned. "I want food. Good, solid syntho-meat. Don't you have any food?" "Solid food in your stomach so soon in this heavy gravity would kill you." She went away and returned quickly with a little cup and spoon, and proceeded to empty the container into his lax mouth a few drops at a time. After a while he ceased his protesting. It was less painful to swallow the slop than to fight it. Very soon afterward, he lost consciousness. Later, he was again aware of his surroundings. He felt tremendously better and observed with a peculiar satisfaction that it was morning. Funny sounds were in the air which he eventually recognized as the cries of wild birds and insects. Insects? He blinked his eyes and struggled to a sitting position and looked worriedly around. Insects can carry disease, he remembered, and wild animals were reported to be carnivorous. His clumsy motions awakened Lois, who had been sleeping beside him. Hal looked down at her with a vague wonder. Such a nice-looking savage, he thought, as she popped open her eyes. She smiled a pleased morning smile at him and lazily stretched. "Hi," she said. "How do you feel?" "Quite mild," Hal admitted with wonder. "Odd, too. That junk you fed me last night must have some very efficient drug in it." "Junk I fed you last night?" Lois echoed, sitting up. Then she laughed her amusement. "Oh, you mean that soup? That wasn't last night, Hal Weber. That was last week." "But I just woke up," he protested. "Yes," she smiled at him, reaching up and patting his cheek affectionately. "You've been a little delirious. Gravity trauma, very common. You get used to it fast, but that's one thing they didn't condition you to, I guess, and your conscience promptly rejected the possibility." Sudden remembrance came to Hal of the agony it had been to move the last time he remembered trying it. Cautiously he lifted an arm and flexed it. He glanced back at Lois, who was watching him with amusement. "It feels all right now. Heavy and clumsy, but no pain." "Good." She stood up and brushed her unruly hair away from her forehead. "I'll fix your breakfast just as soon as I take my bath, all right?" she said. Hal nodded absently. The stream was 20 yards away, and Lois walked quickly over to it. There she pulled her jumper over her head and dove into the crystal water. "Hey, it's cold!" she shrieked. Her vigorous splashing threw sharp brilliance in the early morning sunlight. After a few minutes she came out, letting the water dry on her soft golden skin. Hal was watching her in open-mouthed admiration. It was a most remarkable sensation, this pleasure at seeing her move in that lithe, supple way. He had never before experienced such a thing. As she came up on the grassy bank, she noticed his rapt gaze and quickly snatched up her single garment and held it in front of her. "All right," she told him briskly. "You too. You're much too big for me to handle effectively, so you haven't had a decent bath since we got here. And it gets pretty hot during the day." Obediently, as if in a Vic spell, Hal stood up and walked to the water's edge, keeping his eyes on her. "Look where you're going," she said sharply, and he shook his head dazedly. He slowly removed his clothing, dropped it on the ground, and jumped into the water. That was the end of the spell. The water was like ice. He howled like a wounded animal and tried to jump out again. But the gravity made him clumsy, and he fell back with a great splash. He rose again, gasping and sputtering, making wild, awkward movements in a frenzy to get out of the excruciating coldness. Finally, he was lying on the grass, panting and exhausted. Lois was standing over him, her pale blue eyes dancing with delight. "What a spectacle!" she bubbled merrily. You should have seen yourself. I sure wish I had a vicograph with me. Such performances should be preserved. Unaccountably, Hal found himself gurgling like a delighted baby, and then laughing with her in loud, uncivilized guffaws. After a few minutes, they were both worn out with hilarity. Lois sighed. She gave him a brimming smile and went on back to the lean-to. "Get your clothes on," she said. "I'll have some breakfast for you in a few minutes." It was food, Hal agreed, but it was not very good. It had come out of the standard emergency ration from the aircab master units, and no power on Earth could have made it very palatable. And the supply was nearly gone. "I don't know how we can get back," she said thoughtfully as she chewed on a wafer. "Plenty of aircabs go by. I've seen a dozen or so during the past week. But nobody ever looks out of them except outlanders, and there aren't many of us around. So there isn't any point in building a signal fire." Hal did not reply. He lay back on the grass, his belly full with unaccustomed satisfaction, staring at the blue sky. He decided that he still preferred green. "It's a sort of washed-out colour," he murmured. "What?" "The sky. It's sort of pallid and weak-looking." "That's haze, but spoken like a big, strong man," she said lightly, and then wistfully added, "A pity they always take it out of you." Hal frowned and looked down from the sky to the wind-blown dampness of her golden hair. "What do you mean by that?" he inquired. "Nothing." Her gaze returned modestly to her wafer, and she continued the former subject. "We were talking about getting back to what you call civilization, remember? Or do you prefer we become the new Adam and Eve lost in the wilderness?" she asked, her eyes dancing. "We could start a new primitive dynasty of plain savages." "Oh," Hal's mind came back to the immediate problem. "Oh yes, that's right. We have to get back." He frowned a moment. "Well now, let's see. There are a number of emergency stations spotted around the interurban wilderness. Can't just remember where I learned about them. Must have been treatment information." He thoughtfully picked up a stick and began drawing diagrams of maps in the loose soil. "There," he pointed with the stick. "One of them should be about 200 miles north of where we are now, provided the automatic pilot of my aircab was accurate in its final position fix." Lois was looking at the crude map when he glanced back up at her. There seemed to be a sadness in her expression. She nodded her head at the map. "From that it looks like those emasculating treatments do some good after all." "Don't talk like that," he reproved her. "The civilization conditioning treatment is the basis of our culture." She started to speak, hesitated, and then blurted out, "What precisely does it do for you?" "Don't you know?" Hal asked, astonished, and then answered his own question. "Oh, of course, outlanders would hardly know much about civilized history. Well, before interplanetary exploration was started, there weren't any areas at all like this wilderness. The planet was much too crowded. The people lived in huge contiguous cities and were incessantly battling with each other for economic survival, social survival, and animal survival. The vast majority of the population couldn't stand it. They developed all kinds of psychogenic illnesses. The impact of the uncontrolled inclinations of individuals meeting the absolute self-control required by civilization was killing them. Then, gradually, the civilization conditioning process was developed. What happened then was just what you would expect. The people who took the treatments were so much better adapted to civilized living conditions that the others simply didn't have a chance. Just as soon as planetary colonies were opened up, the savages were all shipped off. There were a lot of riots and small-scale wars for a while, but eventually the superior conditioning of the civilized people won out. After things had stabilized again, anyone who wanted to was permitted to become an Earth citizen, but he had to take the treatment and keep it up. But by that time, most savages had a lot of peculiar prejudices against it, so the population of Earth has remained very small. The robotic defenses of the proprietors protected the planet from further invasion, and now the robotic police maintain order everywhere in the system. Of course, the planets are extremely poor in natural resources, so we supply the basic material even though we relinquished political control long ago. The colonies pay us by sending unusually gifted technicians like your father to work for us. Naturally, outlanders have no rights whatsoever here, not even the right to life or freedom or payment of the material allotment. But unless they commit a crime or otherwise interfere with the proprietors, there is not the slightest danger of being molested by any citizen, because citizens are civilized. Hal stopped his history lecture and looked back up at her. The treatment is responsible for the entire rational order of our culture, as you probably know. But look how insipid it makes you all, she burst out. You're so weak and wishy-washy. There isn't a noble or even a strong sentiment in your entire society. That is how the process works. It is nothing but a series of checks and balances artificially installed in the subconscious, which make strong sentiments unnecessary and which prevent unstable activity. The result is a perfectly smooth existence with no ups or downs, and a perfect cooperation between civilized people. Lois thought this over for a moment. Then she asked curiously, How do you account for the fact that you, after all the treatments you have taken, are so different from other proprietors? Well, she stumbled, blushing a little. You seem perfectly normal in your reactions. Hal shook his head. I don't know. Maybe my last treatment had an error in it. But he shook his head again at that idea because the computer at Central Authority never made mistakes. It is strange. I think it's wonderful. She smiled at him with quick radiance. Hal grinned happily back at her, feeling an alien surge of joy as he looked at the smile and at her. Well, whatever it is, for the next few months or so it looks like we'll be savages in fact. They were, and they took a long time walking north to their destination. It was a remarkably satisfying experience for Hal, and it was for Lois too, as she pointed out to him the night after they found the emergency station. There was a small form-air shelter at the place and a simple automatic distress transmitter which was set in operation by one push of a button. Symbols marked on the case of the transmitter assured them that assistance would be forthcoming within 12 hours. It was their first night in a civilized shelter, and their last night together in the wilderness. Early the next morning, an authority aircab came humming swiftly down to the meadow where they were waiting. Once inside the aircab, Hal became taciturn and thoughtful, but Lois was not disturbed. She talked enough for both of them. Hal luxuriated in the pleasant, reawakened rapport with the things of civilization. Back at the city, they went to Bruckner's residence, and Lois's father rushed outside to greet them. Lois ran happily to him, embracing him and volubly explaining how wonderful Hal was, how he had saved her from being gobbled up by a lot of wild animals, and how strong he was, and sundry other affectionately innocuous exaggerations. Hal looked curiously on for a few minutes in idle wonder at the strange attachments of outlanders. Then Lois proudly pulled him over next to her. Isn't he wonderful? And we're in love. Oh, so much in love. Lois, Bruckner mumbled unhappily. There are some things you have to be told. I should have told you before. You don't have to tell me anything, she bubbled happily. You can say all you want to about the proprietors, but this one is different. He's real. Hal laughed diffidently and moved a little further away from her. He gazed around at the city, recognizing it with thirsty familiarity, happily part of it again. The experience of the past 3 months already seemed far away. Hal, Lois murmured, suddenly aware of his rapidly growing coolness. Hal, darling, what's wrong? Why, nothing at all, Lois. He looked at her uncomfortably for a moment and backed a step further. It's just, well, you know. Oh, no, you don't, she cried, rushing up to him and grabbing his arm. Where are you going? Dad! Please, Miss Bruckner, Hal murmured mildly, disengaging his arm from her. He gazed hungrily around him again the moment she let go, and looked back at her only when he was startled by a sudden choking sob. Lois was staring at him, her fist to her mouth, the pale blue eyes brimming. "Oh, no," she cried tremulously. "Lois," Bruckner said, his voice sounding harsh with repressed emotions. "Come in here. You've got to know what the situation is." He put his arm around her trembling shoulders and led her off, glaring at Hal in helpless fury. The moment they were out of sight, Hal turned and stepped back into the air cab. He ordered it to take him home. His parents were there watching a Vic entertainment, which Hal promptly turned off. "Who did that?" his father mumbled, coming immediately out of the trance. "Hal, that wasn't a very nice thing to do, son." "Why, Hal," his mother sighed mildly, "you're not dead after all. How nice. Don't pay any attention to your father. It wasn't a very interesting Vic anyway." "Shouldn't turn it off like that, though." Sorry," Hal apologized gently. He relaxed into the comfortable, perfect fit of a form-air lounge. "Just thought I'd let you know I'm still alive." "Well, we're glad," his mother murmured absently. "Must have been pretty awful." "That's the funny thing about it, though. I didn't mind it a bit at the time. Very curious. I had an Outlander woman with me, Bruckner's daughter, as a matter of fact." "Oh dear," Mrs. Webber sighed. "Poor Hal." "Well, like I say, it wasn't exactly mild, but it was quite tolerable somehow." He frowned just slightly and shook his head at the puzzling incongruity. He recalled his 3 months of association with the uncivilized woman, somewhat wistfully contemplating strong, overpowering sentiments in a chaotic wilderness. "Anyway," he said at last, "I'm home again and it's all over. I won't have anything to do with her now." "Yes," Mrs. Webber murmured. "Odd that you should have survived, though, isn't it? I thought a civilized man in the wilderness would die almost at once." Webber gave the cultured equivalent of a mild snort. "Of course he could survive. Oh," and he laughed softly in apology. "That's right. I forgot to tell you about that." The eyes of his wife politely turned to him, and he explained. "A couple of weeks after our son here apparently had been killed, I happened to run into an authority physician. I mentioned it to him just in passing. He told me that there was a factor in the CC treatment that provided for such things. It seems that the civilization conditioning they give you is only designed to enable a man to survive in a city. In order for the conditioning to function, you have to have that civilized urban environment. Once the environment is removed, the conditioned complex has nothing to react against, and the man immediately becomes almost, but not quite, as savage as a typical Outlander. That way, a civilized man can always manage to live in the wilderness given half a chance. Once he gets back into a city again, the proper civilized environment is returned, the conditioning starts functioning immediately, and presto, the man is civilized again." "Well, now that's nice," Mrs. Webber said placidly. "Wouldn't like to see my boy dead." "Yes," her husband mused. "The physician told me that right after we decided Hal was dead. I was going to mention it to you, but it slipped my mind somehow." "Well, you're just a tiny bit forgetful at times, dear." Mrs. Webber sighed softly and turned to her son. "Hal, dear, it's awfully nice to see you back again. Would you be kind enough to switch the Vic back on?" Contentedly, Hal complied and was himself immediately carried away by the vicarious entertainment, pleased to put the disturbing dream of the past 3 months comfortably behind him. Remember to hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks. Manners of the Age by H.B. Fyfe. Narrated by William Skye. With everyone gone elsewhere, Earth was perfect for gracious living. Only there was nothing gracious about it. The red tennis robot scooted desperately across the court, its 4 wide-set wheels squealing. For a moment, Robert's hard-hit passing shot seemed to have scored. Then, at the last instant, the robot whipped around its single racket-equipped arm. Robert sprawled headlong in a futile lunge at the return. "Game and set to Red 3, announced the referee box from its high station above the net. "Oh, shut up," growled Robert, and flung down his racket for one of the white serving robots to retrieve. "Yes, Robert," agreed the voice. "Will Robert continue to play?" Interpreting the man's savage mumble as a negative, it told his opponent, "Return to your stall, Red 3. Robert strode off wordlessly toward the house. Reaching the 100-foot square swimming pool, he hesitated uncertainly. "Weather's so damned hot," he muttered. "Why didn't the old-time scientists find out how to do something about that while there were still enough people on Earth to manage it?" He stripped off his damp clothing and dropped it on the beach of white sand. Behind him sounded the steps of a humanoid serving robot hastening to pick it up. Robert plunged deep into the cooling water and let himself float lazily to the surface. Maybe they did, he thought. I could send a robot over to the old city library for information. Still, actually doing anything would probably take the resources of a good many persons, and it isn't so easy to find people now that Earth is practically deserted. He rolled sideward for a breath and began to swim slowly for the opposite side of the pool, reflecting upon the curious culture of the planet. Although he had accepted this all his life, it really was remarkable how the original home of the human race had been forsaken for fresher worlds among the stars. Or was it more remarkable that a few individuals had asserted their independence by remaining? Robert was aware that the decision involved few difficulties, considering the wealth of robots and other automatic machines. He regretted knowing so few humans, though they were really not necessary. If not for his hobby of televising, he would probably not know any at all. "Wonder how far past the old city I'd have to go to meet someone in person," he murmured as he pulled himself from the pool. "Maybe I ought to try accepting that televised invitation of the other night." Several dark userform robots were smoothing the sand on this beach under the direction of a blue humanoid supervisor. Watching them idly, Robert estimated that it must be 10 years since he had seen another human face to face. His parents were dim memories. He got along very well, however, with robots to serve him or to obtain occasional information from the automatic scanners of the city library that had long ago been equipped to serve such a purpose. "Much better than things were in the old days," he told himself as he crossed the lawn to his sprawling white mansion. "Must have been awful before the population declined. Imagine having people all around you, having to listen to them, see them, and argue to make them do what you wanted." The heel of his bare right foot came down heavily on a pebble, and he swore without awareness of the precise meaning of the ancient phrases. He limped into the baths and beckoned a waiting robot as he stretched out on a rubbing table. "Call Blue 1, he ordered. The red robot pushed a button on the wall before beginning the massage. In a few moments, the majordomo arrived. "Did Robert enjoy the tennis?" it inquired politely. "I did not," snapped the man. "Red 3 won, and by too big a score. Have it geared down a few feet per second." "Yes, Robert." "And have the lawn screened again for pebbles." As Blue 1 retired, he relaxed and turned his mind to ideas for filling the evening. He hoped Henry would televise. Robert had news for him. After a short nap and dinner, he took the elevator to his 3-story tower and turned on the television robot. Seating himself in a comfortable armchair, he directed the machine from one channel to another. For some time there was no answer to his perfunctory call signals, but one of his few acquaintances finally came on. "Jack here," said a quiet voice that Robert had long suspected of being disguised by a filter microphone. "I haven't heard you for some weeks," he remarked, eyeing the swirling colours on the screen. He disliked Jack for never showing his face, but curiosity as to what lay behind the mechanical image projected by the other's transmitter preserved the acquaintance. "I was Busy, said the bodiless voice, with a discreet hint of a chuckle that Robert found chilling. He wondered what Jack had been up to. He remembered once being favoured with a televised view of Jack's favourite sport, a battle between companies of robots designed for the purpose, horribly reminiscent of human conflicts Robert had seen on historical films. He soon made an excuse to break off and set the robot to scanning Henry's channel. He had something to tell the older man, who lived only about 100 miles away and was as close to being his friend as was possible in this age of scattered, self-sufficient dwellings. I don't mind talking to him, Robert reflected. At least he doesn't overdo this business of individual privacy. He thought briefly of the disdainful face, seemingly on a distant station, which had merely examined him for several minutes one night without ever condescending to speak. Recalling his rage at this treatment, Robert wondered how the ancients had managed to get along together when there were so many of them. They must have had some strict code of behaviour, he supposed, or they never would have bred so enormous a population. I must find out about that some day, he decided. How did you act, for instance, if you wanted to play tennis, but someone else just refused and went to eat dinner? Maybe that was why the ancients had so many murders. He noticed that the robot was getting an answer from Henry's station, and was pleased. He could talk as long as he liked, knowing Henry would not resent his cutting off any time he became bored with the conversation. The robot focused the image smoothly. Henry gave the impression of being a small man. He was grey and wrinkled compared with Robert, but his black eyes were alertly sharp. He smiled his greeting and immediately launched into a story of one of his youthful trips through the mountains, from the point at which it had been interrupted the last time they had talked. Robert listened impatiently. Maybe I have some interesting news, he remarked as the other finished. I picked up a new station the other night. That reminds me of a time when I was a boy and... Robert fidgeted while Henry described watching his father build a spare television set as a hobby, with only a minimum of robot help. He pounced upon the first pause. A new station, he repeated. Came in very well, too. I can't imagine why I never picked it up before. Distant, perhaps? Asked Henry resignedly. No, not very far from me, as a matter of fact. You can't always tell, especially with the ocean so close. Now that there are so few people, you'd think there'd be land enough for all of them, but a good many spend all their lives aboard ship robots. Not this one, said Robot. She even showed me an outside view of her home. Henry's eyebrows rose. She? A woman? Her name is Marcia Joan. Well, well, said Henry. Imagine that. Women, as I recall, usually do have funny names. He gazed thoughtfully at his well-kept hands. Did I ever tell you about the last woman I knew? He asked. About 20 years ago. We had a son, you know, but he grew up and wanted his own home and robots. Natural enough, Robert commented, somewhat briefly since Henry had told him the story before. I often wonder what became of him, mused the older man. That's the trouble with what's left of Earth culture. No families anymore. Now he'll tell me about the time he lived in a crowd of 5, thought Robert. He, his wife, their boy, and the visiting couple with the fleet of robot helicopters. Deciding that Henry could reminisce just as well without a listener, Robert quietly ordered the robot to turn itself off. Maybe I will make the trip, he pondered on the way downstairs, if only to see what it's like with another person about. At about noon of the second day after that, he remembered that thought with regret. The ancient roads, seldom used and never repaired, were rough and bumpy. Having no flying robots, Robert was compelled to transport himself and a few mechanical servants in ground vehicles. He had, idiotically he now realized, started with the dawn and was already tired. Consequently, he was perhaps unduly annoyed when 2 tiny spy eyes flew down from the hills to hover above his caravan on whirring little propellers. He tried to glance up pleasantly while their lenses televised pictures to their base, but he feared that his smile was strained. The spy eyes retired after a few minutes. Robert's vehicle, at his voiced order, turned onto a road leading between two forested hills. Right there, he thought 4 hours later, was where I made my mistake. I should have turned back and gone home. He stood in the doorway of a small cottage of pale blue trimmed with yellow, watching his robots unload baggage. They were supervised by Blue 2, the spare for Blue 1. Also watching, as silently as Robert, was a pink and blue striped robot which had guided the caravan from the entrance gate to the cottage. After one confused protest in a curiously high voice, it had not spoken. Maybe we shouldn't have driven through that flower bed, thought Robert. Still, the thing ought to be versatile enough to say so. I wouldn't have such a gimcrack contraption. He looked up as another humanoid robot in similar colours approached along the line of shrubs separating the main lawns from that surrounding the cottage. Marcia Joan has finished her nap. You may come to the house now. Robert's jaw hung slack as he sought for a reply. His face flushed at the idea of a robot offering him permission to enter the house. Nevertheless, he followed it across the wide lawn and between banks of gaily blossoming flowers to the main house. Robert was not sure which colour scheme he disliked more, that of the robot or the unemphatic pastel tints of the house. The robot led the way inside and along a hall. It pulled back a curtain near the other end, revealing a room with furniture for human use. Robert stared at the girl, who sat in an armchair clad in a long robe of soft pink material. She looked a few years younger than he. Her hair and eyes were also brown, though darker. In contrast to Robert's, her smooth skin was only lightly tanned, and she wore her hair much longer. He thought her oval face might have been pleasant if not for the analytical expression she wore. I am quite human, he said in annoyance. Do you have a voice? She rose and walked over to him curiously. Robert saw that she was several inches shorter than he, about the height of one of his robots. He condescended to bear her scrutiny. You look just as you do on the telescreen, she marvelled. Robert began to wonder if the girl were feeble-minded. How else should he look? I usually swim at this hour, he said to change the subject. Where is the pool? Marcia Jones stared at him. Pool of what? She asked. Sensing sarcasm, he scowled. Pool of water, of course, to swim in. What did you think I meant? A pool of oil? I am not acquainted with your habits, retorted the girl. None of that stupid wit, he snapped. Where is the pool? Don't shout, shouted the girl. Her voice was high and unpleasantly shrill compared with his. I don't have a pool. Who wants a swimming pool anyway? Robert felt his face flushing with rage. So she won't tell me, he thought. All right, I'll find it myself. Everybody has a pool. And if she comes in, I'll hold her head under for a while. Sneering, he turned toward the nearest exit from the house. The gaily striped robot hastened after him. The door failed to swing back as it should have at Robert's approach. Impatiently, he seized the ornamental handle. He felt his shoulder grasped by a metal hand. Do not use the front door, said the robot. Let go, ordered Robert, incensed that any robot should presume to hinder him. Only Marcia Joan uses this door, said the robot, ignoring Robert's displeasure. I'll use it if I like, declared Robert, jerking the handle. The next moment he was lifted bodily into the air. By the time he realized what was happening, he was carried face down along the hall. Too astonished even to yell, he caught a glimpse of Marcia Jones' tiny feet beneath the hem of her pink robe as his head passed the curtained doorway. The robot clumped onto the door at the rear of the house and out into the sunshine. There it released its grip. When Robert regained the breath knocked out of him by the drop and assured himself that no bones were broken, his anger returned. I'll find it, wherever it is, he growled and set out to search the grounds. About 20 minutes later, he was forced to admit that there really was no swimming pool. Except for a brook 50 yards away, there was only the tiled bathroom of the cottage to bathe in. "Primitive!" exclaimed Robert, eyeing this. "Manually operated water supply, too. I must have the robots fix something better for tomorrow." Since none of his robots was equipped with a thermometer, he had to draw the bath himself. Meanwhile, he gave orders to Blue 2 regarding the brook and a place to swim. He managed to fill the tub without scalding himself, mainly because there was no hot water. His irritation, by the time he had dressed in fresh clothes and prepared for another talk with his hostess, was still lively. "Ah, you return," Marcia Joan commented from a window above the back door. "It is time to eat," said Robert frankly. "You are mistaken." He glanced at the sunset, which was already fading. "It is time," he insisted. "I always eat at this hour." "Well, I don't." Robert leaned back to examine her expression more carefully. He felt very much the way he had the day the water supply robot for his pool had broken down and, despite Robert's bellowed orders, had flooded a good part of the lawn before Blue One had disconnected it. Some instinct warned him, moreover, that bellowing now would be as useless as it had been then. "What do you do now?" he asked. "I dress for the evening." "And when do you eat?" "After I finish dressing." "I'll wait for you," said Robert, feeling that much tolerance could do no particular harm. He encountered the pink and blue robot in the hall, superintending several plain yellow ones bearing dishes and covered platters. Robert followed them to a dining room. "Marcia Jones sits there," the major domo informed him as he moved toward the only chair at the table. Robert warily retreated to the opposite side of the table and looked for another chair. None was visible. Of course, he thought, trying to be fair. Why should anybody in this day have more than one chair? Robots don't sit. He waited for the major domo to leave, but it did not. The serving robots finished laying out the dishes and retired to posts along the wall. Finally, Robert decided that he would have to make his status clear or risk going hungry. If I sit down somewhere, he decided, it may recognize me as human. What a stupid machine to have! He started around the end of the table again, but the striped robot moved to intercept him. Robert stopped. "Oh well," he sighed, sitting sidewise on a corner of the table. The robot hesitated, made one or two false starts in different directions, then halted. The situation had apparently not been included among its memory tapes. Robert grinned and lifted the cover of the nearest platter. He managed to eat, despite his ungraceful position and what he considered the scarcity of the food. Just as he finished the last dish, he heard footsteps in the hall. Marcia Joan had dressed in a fresh robe of crimson. Its thinner material was gathered at the waists by clasps of gleaming gold. The arrangement emphasized bodily contours Robert had previously seen only in historical films. He became aware that she was regarding him with much the same suggestion of helpless dismay as the major domo. "Why, you've eaten it all!" she exclaimed. "All?" snorted Robert. "There was hardly any food." Marcia Joan walked slowly around the table, staring at the empty dishes. "A few bits of raw vegetables, and the tiniest portion of protein concentrate I ever saw," Robert continued. "Do you call that a dinner to serve a guest?" "And I especially ordered 2 portions. 2? Robert repeated in astonishment. "You must visit me sometime. I'll show you." "What's the matter with my food?" interrupted the girl. "I followed the best diet advice my robots could find in the city library." "They should have looked for human diets, not songbirds." He lifted a cover in hopes of finding some overlooked morsel, but the platter was bare. "No wonder you act so strangely," he said. "You must be suffering from malnutrition. I don't wonder with a skimpy diet like this." "It's very healthful," insisted Marcia Joan. "The old film said it was good for the figure, too." "Not interested," grunted Robert. "I'm satisfied as I am." "Oh, yes? You look gawky to me." You don't, retorted Robert, examining her disdainfully. You are short and stubby and too plump. Plump? Worse, you're actually fat in lots of places I'm not. At least not between the ears. Robert blinked. What? And besides, she stormed on, those robots you brought are painted the most repulsive colours. Robert closed his mouth and silently sought the connection. Robots, he thought. Not fat, but repulsive colours, she said. What has that to do with food? The woman seems incapable of logic. And furthermore, Marcia Joan was saying, I'm not sure I care for the looks of you. Lulu, put him out. Who's Lulu? Demanded Robert. Then, as the major domo moved forward, he understood. What a silly name for a robot, he exclaimed. I suppose you'd call it Robert. Will you go now, or shall I call more robots? I am not a fool, said Robert haughtily. I shall go. Thank you for the disgusting dinner. Do not use the front door, said the robot. Only Marcia Joan uses that. All robots use other doors. Robert growled but walked down the hall to the back door. As this swung open to permit his passage, he halted. It's dark out there now, he complained over his shoulder. Don't you have any lights on your grounds? Do you want me to trip over something? Of course I have ground lights, shrilled Marcia Joan. I'll show you. Not that I care if you trip or not. A moment later, lights concealed among the trees glowed into life. Robert walked outside and turned toward the cottage. I should have asked her what the colours of my robots had to do with it, he thought, and turned back to re-enter. He walked right into the closed door, which failed to open before him, though it had operated smoothly a moment ago. Robots not admitted after dark, a mechanical voice informed him. Return to your stall in the shed. Whom do you think you're talking to? Demanded Robert. I'm not one of your robots. There was a pause. Is it Marcia Joan? Asked the voice box after considerable buzzing and whirring. No, I'm Robert. There was another pause while the mechanism laboriously shifted back to its other speech tape. Then, robots not admitted after dark. Return to your stall in the shed. Robert slowly raised both hands to his temples. Lingeringly, he dragged them down over his cheeks and under his chin, until at last the fingers interlaced over his tight lips. After a moment, he let out his breath between his fingers and dropped his hands to his sides. He raised one foot to kick, but decided that the door looked too hard. He walked away between the beds of flowers, grumbling. Reaching the vicinity of the cottage, he parted the tall shrubs bordering its grounds and looked through carefully before proceeding. Pleased at the gleam of water, he called Blue too. Good enough. Put the other robots away for the night. They can trim the edges tomorrow. He started into the cottage, but his major domo warned. Someone comes. Robert looked around. Through thin portions of the shrubbery, he caught a glimpse of Marcia Joan's crimson robe, nearly black in the diffused glow of the lights illuminating the grounds. Robert! Called the girl angrily. What are your robots doing? I saw them from my upstairs window. Wait there! Exclaimed Robert as he reached the shrubs. What? Are you trying to tell me where I can go or not go? Eeh! The shriek was followed by a tremendous splash. Robert stepped forward in time to be spattered by part of the flying spray. It was cold. Naturally being drawn from the brook, he reflected. Oh well, the sun will warm it tomorrow. There was a frenzy of thrashing and splashing in the dimly lighted water at his feet, accompanied by coughs and spluttering demands that he do something. Robert reached down with one hand, caught his hostess by the wrist, and heaved her up to solid ground. My robots are digging you a little swimming hole, he told her. They brought the water from the brook by a trench. You can finish it with concrete or plastics later. It's only 15 by 30 feet. He expected some sort of acknowledgement of his efforts and peered at her through the gloom when none was forthcoming. He thus caught a glimpse of the full swinging slap aimed at his face. He tried to duck. There was another splash, followed by more floundering about. "Reach up," said Robert patiently, "and I'll pull you out again. I didn't expect you to like it this much." Marcia Jones scrambled up the bank, tugged viciously at her sodden robe, and headed for the nearest pathway without replying. Robert followed along. As they passed under one of the lights, he noticed that the red reflections of the wet material, where it clung snugly to the girl's body, were almost the colour of some of his robots. The tennis robot, he thought, and the moving targets for archery. In fact, all the sporting equipment. "You talk about food for the figure," he remarked lightly. "You should see yourself now. It's really funny the way—" He stopped. Some strange emotion stifled his impulse to laugh at the way the robe clung. Instead, he lengthened his stride, but he was still a few feet behind when she charged through the front entrance of the house. The door, having opened automatically for her, started to swing closed. Robert sprang forward to catch it. "Wait a minute!" he cried. Marcia Jones snapped something that sounded like, "Get out!" over her shoulder and squished off toward the stairs. As Robert started through the door to follow, the striped robot hastened toward him from its post in the hall. "Do not use the front door," it warned him. "Out of my way!" growled Robert. The robot reached out to enforce the command. Robert seized it by the forearm and put all his weight into a sudden tug. The machine tottered off balance. Releasing his grip, he sent it staggering out the door with a quick shove. A hasty glance showed Marcia Jones flapping wetly up the last steps. Robert turned to face the robot. "Do not use that door," he quoted vindictively, and the robot halted its rush indecisively. "Only Marcia Jones uses it." The major domo hesitated. After a moment, it strode off around the corner of the house. First darting one more look at the stairs, Robert thrust his head outside and shouted, "Blue 2!" He held the door open while he waited. There was an answer from the shrubbery. Presently, his own supervisor hurried up. "Fetch the emergency toolbox," Robert ordered, "and bring a couple of others with you." "Naturally, Robert. I would not carry it myself." A moment after the robot had departed on the errand, heavy steps sounded at the rear of the hall. Marcia Jones' robot had dealt with the mechanism of the back door. Robert eyed the metal mask as the robot walked up to him. He found the colour contrast less pleasant than ever. "I am not using the door," he said hastily. "I am merely holding it open." "Do you intend to use it?" "I haven't decided." "I shall carry you out back," the robot decided for him. "No, you don't!" exclaimed Robert, leaping backward. The door immediately began to swing shut as he passed through. Cursing, he lunged forward. The robot reached for him. This time, Robert missed his grip. Before he could duck away, his wrist was trapped in a metal grasp. "The door will close," he despaired. "They'll be too late." Then, suddenly, he felt the portal drawn back and heard Blue 2 speak. "What does Robert wish?" "Throw this heap out the door," gasped Robert. Amid a trampling of many feet, the major domo was raised bodily by Blue 2 and another pair of Robert's machines, and hustled outside. Since the grip on Robert's wrist was not relaxed, he involuntarily accompanied the rush of metal bodies. "Catch the door!" he called to Blue 2. When the latter sprang to obey, the other two took the action as a signal to drop their burden. The pink and blue robot landed full length with a jingling crash. Robert was free. With the robots, he made for the entrance. Hearing footsteps behind him as the major domo regained its feet, he slipped hastily inside. "Pick up that toolbox," he snapped. "When that robot stops in the doorway, knock its head off." Turning, he held up a finger. "Do not use the front door." The major domo hesitated. The heavy toolbox in the grip of Blue 2 descended with a thud. The pink and blue robot landed on the ground a yard or two outside the door, as if dropped from the second floor. It bounced once, emitted a few sparks and pungent wisps of smoke, lay still. "Never mind, that's good enough," said Robert as Blue 2 stepped forward. "One of the others can drag it off to the repair shop. Have the toolbox brought with us." "What does Robert wish now?" inquired Blue 2, trailing the man toward the stairway. "I'm going upstairs," said Robert, "and I intend to be prepared if any more doors are closed against me." He started up, the measured treads of his own robot sounding reassuringly behind him. It was about a week later that Robert sat relaxed in the armchair before his own telescreen, facing Henry's wizened visage. The elder man clucked sympathetically as he re-examined the scratches on Robert's face and the bruise under his right eye. "And so you left there in the morning?" "I certainly did," declared Robert. "We registered a marriage record at the city library by television, of course, but I don't care if I never see her again. She needn't even tell me about the child, if any. I simply can't stand that girl." Now, Henry said. "I mean it. Absolutely no consideration for my wishes. Everything in the house was run to suit her convenience." "After all," Henry pointed out, "it is her house." Robert glared. "What has that to do with it? I don't think I was as unreasonable as she said in smashing that robot. The thing just wouldn't let me alone." "I guess," Henry suggested, "it was conditioned to obey Marcia Joan, not you." "Well, that shows you. Whose orders are to count anyway? When I tell a robot to do something, I expect it done. How would you like to find robots trying to boss you around?" "Are you talking about robots?" asked Henry, "or the girl?" "Same thing, isn't it? Or it would be if I decided to bring her home with me." "Conflict of desires," murmured Henry. "Exactly. It's maddening to have a perfectly logical action interfered with because there's another person present to insist, mind you, on having her way. And for 20-odd years you've had your own way in every tiny thing." Somewhere in the back of Robert's lurked a feeling that Henry sounded slightly sarcastic. "Well, why shouldn't I?" he demanded. "I noticed that in every disagreement my view was the right one." "It was? Of course it was. What did you mean by that tone?" "Nothing." Henry seemed lost in thought. "I was just wondering how many right views are left on this planet. There must be quite a few, all different, even if we have picked up only a few by television. An interesting facet of our peculiar culture. Every individual omnipotent and omniscient, within his own sphere." Robert regarded him with indignant incredulity. "You don't seem to understand my point," he began again. "I told her we ought to come to my house where things are better arranged, and she simply refused. Contradicted me. It was most—" He broke off. "The impudence of him!" he exclaimed. "Signing off when I wanted to talk!" Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this compilation, hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe for more narrations every Monday and Friday. And remember, you can go one step further by joining my Patreon. There you get exclusive novelettes by the great authors like Ray Bradbury, Poul Anderson, Evelyn E. Smith, and Fritz Leiber, who wrote the first story in this compilation. For that and ad-free video and audio versions of stories and full novels 6 months early, head to patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF. Or, staying on YouTube, if you're after another compilation, check out 5 winsome and wistful sci-fi short stories. A link to that video is on screen now.